Hi, my name is Jeff Renard. I am a senior system engineer with Nutanix, based out of Los Angeles. I work with major accounts in Southern California and nationally. And we're here today to talk about closing big data opportunities on Nutanix. So, big data, right? These are applications like Splunk, like Hadoop, like Apache Spark, that are certainly moving into the arena of virtualization. And if you're in an opportunity where you're selling big data, obviously the customer has recognized that there are some pain points associated with the traditional physical deployment of some of these applications, right? Upgrades on these apps are starting to become very frequent. The big data teams, whether that be analytics or security guys or ladies or the data scientists inside of an account, they're starting to recognize that the infrastructure management overhead of managing their 40 node, 200 node, 1,000 node cluster physically is something they no longer want the burden of. Maybe they're handing that over to their virtualization teams. These are the pain points: the physical sprawl, the lack of the deployment flexibility. Right? Maybe they've started to look at Acropolis Hypervisor on Nutanix because typical virtualization licensing has been too expensive. So we've recognized that, we've moved into these opportunities. How do we actually close this opportunity? So what I've found, I've had some success with big data in my patch. Splunk has actually been an early application for Nutanix in the big data space. Nutanix actually has some very, very large customers running traditional Hadoop style big data applications on Nutanix. In my patch, I have some emerging success with Hadoop, Apache Spark and the like. But I've seen Splunk deployments, and Splunk seems to be an application that is driving a lot of value inside of organizations. But what I found is I need to be prepared to really educate the security teams, for example, on the value of virtualization, on the value of Nutanix. What I've also found is that Acropolis Hypervisor really clicks with Linux admins. A lot of the guys in the security world, in the data science world, folks who are familiar with big data, they're Linux teams often. They're folks who are comfortable with automation, and the Acropolis Hypervisor really makes a lot of sense to them. They're familiar with KVM, they've been standing up infrastructure on their own, they're accustomed to having a little bit of DIY, and the Acropolis Hypervisor removes all of that from a hypervisor that they already trust. They already know KVM, they know that it's secure, they know that it's stable. The Acropolis Hypervisor takes that to the next level and gives them all those enterprise management features that have been lacking from that solution traditionally. I found that the actual sales cycle tends to really move outside the typical infrastructure teams that we tend to do a lot of selling to. I'm talking to new audiences. I'm having to bring in resources from Nutanix to really bridge the gap. There's a conversation that many of us maybe are not equipped to have with some of these folks who they don't speak infrastructure. Maybe we don't speak big data. And then just sort of as a high level, POCs are probably inevitable. So what does a big data POC actually look like? The thing is, you're preparing to combat the bare metal deployment, right? So you've moved into a POC, and that POC is always going to be really to demonstrate that there's not some gap between a virtualized deployment of this application and its physical counterpart, because the competition for these types of opportunities is almost always going to be bare metal, right? Now, we see emerging use cases for these apps up in the cloud. Obviously, both AWS and Azure are beginning to be places where we're seeing actually rather large deployments of these big data type applications. But most of the time for on-prem deployments, the competition is going to be bare metal, because that's what the data scientists, the security teams have been accustomed to. They didn't have potentially the skill set to build out big back-end shared storage infrastructure. There were performance benefits to not incurring the latency of talking to big back-end shared storage. The actual architecture itself of a lot of these big data technologies very much mirrors the way that Nutanix works, right? We see the value in a highly distributed architecture. It's what we sell. And I think that a lot of the data scientists and the like, the folks leveraging these applications and driving value inside their business, they're working with very, very large sets of data, as we would sort of assume often. And those large sets of data are, latency sensitive. There's performance metrics. I mean, we could have, 60, 100, 200, 400, 1,000 servers operating on a data set, and even small changes in the performance characteristics of that cluster could have big benefits to the company. The competition of cloud services also not to be underestimated, but that's where cost is really your friend, right? The operational overhead of some cluster in AWS that's going to scale to, hundreds of nodes, and potentially a massive data set. Those costs are unavoidable. They're going to get very, very large very quickly. Great opportunity for us to really compete on our modular scale-out model. So once we've sort of bridged this gap of really convincing the teams that the infrastructure is functional and that there's not some huge performance delta between the virtualized iteration and their homegrown build-it-yourself white box deployment of their application, how do we actually bring this deal home? How do we actually close it? Now, obviously, this is where the business is going to need to be involved, and you want to really leverage our subject matter experts, right? We can have conversations at all levels of the organization. Oftentimes, the teams that have been standing up these clusters, their incremental costs have been very low. They've been going out, buying a server or maybe 100 servers, but that cost is not the same as maybe potentially a large upfront capital expenditure of anything, whether it be Nutanix or any traditional stack. But helping really bridge the gap between folks who may not really be all that skilled selling internally. What I found is a lot of the teams that are purchasing applications like Splunk, they're not as necessarily as able to articulate the value of a solution like Nutanix, certainly as well as we are. So we need to really step in and make sure that we're able to do that to the executives, able to do that to the IT teams, bridge all those teams together. Leverage Nutanix references. Big data was one of the original use cases that Nutanix was deployed for in the field, and we have big data DNA. It's in our architecture. We're finding that a lot of data scientists, a lot of the guys who have familiarity with these technologies, they just understand Nutanix intuitively. It makes sense to them. Locally attached storage, sure. Scale-out architecture, absolutely. Distributed NoSQL metadata store makes total sense to us. And when you can have those conversations and get alignment with the guys who are really driving a tremendous amount of value inside the organization, this deal is going to be much, much easier for you to close. Because these deals can be very, very sizable. And the fact that these deals are sizable and that they're large, lifecycle management is huge. Make sure you take an opportunity to actually guide these teams through an upgrade of the Nutanix platform during any kind of POC. Make sure that they understand how easy it is to deploy VMs on the Acropolis hypervisor. Show them the APIs and make sure that everybody really is understanding that their automation toolkit that they've been leveraging to manage their big Frankenstein physical deployment, that same methodology is going to be applicable to their Nutanix deployment, but everything's going to be so much simpler. If you do all of those things and bring the application owners to the table, talk to the executives, really drive the business value, and make sure that IT understands now that you're bringing this new application into the fold without increasing the amount of work that they have to do and complexity they have to manage, these deals are going to get closed for you. And it's a fantastic use case for Nutanix. These deals are challenging. Big data opportunities, much like opportunities to virtualize networking or some of these emerging areas, they're tough. These are areas where virtualization has not necessarily had as much traction over the last decade as in some other areas, right? This is areas where some of the largest traditional virtualization vendors have not had a lot of success. They've been trying. The Acropolis hypervisor we're seeing in Nutanix is having immediate traction, really growing on the fact that KVM has had a lot of success as a virtualization platform for big data, mostly because it was free, right? That the KVM was perceived of as a lower cost alternative, and oftentimes the data scientists and the big data teams, they needed to go for the lower cost alternative even if there was a huge operational overhead because they didn't really know if they were going to be able to drive value. Well, now today, you look at applications like Splunk, you look at the kind of value that's being driven out of big data in retail and automotive and information security and banking and the like. These are real projects with real budgets. And it's time to help these folks understand that there's a transition to a level of operational simplicity they haven't brought on board with yet. They're not experiencing the Nutanix goodness. We can really help them with that. Oftentimes these deals need external assistance, right? The IT team needs to really participate. You need C-level buy-in. Engage us, get the executive teams involved, get our subject matter experts involved to talk to the right people, make your life a whole lot easier. And then the Acropolis hypervisor changes everything, right? An API-driven management stack on top of KVM, one of the most secure hypervisors on the market, hardened out of the gate. This is a language that data scientists speak. The Acropolis hypervisor is very, very appealing to them. Lead with it. You'll bring down some great business. Thanks. My name is Jeff Renard. Look forward to seeing you in the field.